Good evening and welcome to this fourth in our webinar series on reimagining the world after COVID-19. Thank you for joining us. This event will be called Inequality After COVID. These webinars are organized by the Institute for the Future of Knowledge at the University of Johannesburg in partnership with the Library and Information Centre, and we are very grateful to them for their excellent support in this novel technological context. This is part of a larger project initiated by the Vice-Chancellor's Office that seeks to look past the current turmoil and ask what comes next. It already feels like a remarkably long time ago and a remarkably different context in which we ran the very first of these, which was merely 3 weeks ago. And so that just shows the importance of trying to raise ourselves above the waves, so to speak, and think a little bit further ahead, especially since foresight is something that could have helped us a lot in the current situation and perhaps to avoid it. Please note this is a live event and that audio, video and chat functions are recorded. Audience microphones and cameras are off. You're welcome to pose questions to our panelists using the question function. Please bear in mind we may not be able to get to your question. Please also remember that people can see your questions. This is an academic forum. That means that freedom of expression is protected on condition that what you express is courteously expressed. Today's event is titled Inequality After COVID. The COVID-19 pandemic has magnified inequalities between and across different groups and countries across the world. Effective social protection has been critical to the reduction of vulnerability. However, as many countries have struggled to provide universal health care, the outbreak of COVID-19 has put pressure on healthcare systems globally. This has seen governments redirecting fiscus towards curtailing the effects of the pandemic, including in countries where health systems are under-resourced and poorly staffed. So far as we know, COVID-19 is markedly more dangerous for older people. Higher proportions of serious, critical and fatal COVID-19 are also observed among those suffering from certain other diseases such as diabetes, hypertension and heart disease. On the other hand, certain population groups are disproportionately impacted by economic and social disruption caused both by the disease itself and by measures that are taken in an effort to curtail its spread. It's also notable in the developing world context, in the UK, for example, and in America, that people of African origin and of other minority ethnic groups, minority in those contexts, seem to suffer disproportionately at younger ages from serious, critical and fatal COVID-19. So there are considerable inequalities in the way the disease unfolds, and there are considerable inequalities in the way that measures that are taken to address the unfolding of the disease have an impact. This webinar will explore the various issues concerning inequality that COVID-19 has highlighted, as well as those created by the response to the disease, the dramatic economic and social and political responses. Fundamentally, what I think we would all like to know is, are there choices that we can make now as nations and as a world that will reduce the inequality and the hardship that falls on those at the bottom of the global pile? Misfortune typically does increase inequality. Is there a way that we can minimize that increase? So I would like to start by talking to Professor Mpedi. Professor Mpedi, are you receiving me?
Yes, Prof. Broadbent, good evening. I can hear and see you.
That's great.
After so many months, yes.
After so many months. So, yes. Professor Mpedi is the Executive Dean at Law at the University of Johannesburg. And I've worked with him in that context and I must say very much enjoyed doing so. He is an expert in labour law and in social protection. And Professor Mpedi, it's wonderful to have you speaking to us. So to kick off, can I ask about the question of balance? So COVID-19 has been constructed as a threat to life. It is a threat to life. And to what extent can policymakers draw a balance between a threat to life, that's when it's presented as such, and other measures that might be taken? I mean, you know, we ordinarily do accept certain threats to life. For example, the threat of dying in a road traffic accident. We trade that off against the convenience of being able to travel in a car or a motor vehicle. how should policymakers, are there principles that policymakers should employ when they're making those sorts of trade-offs?
Thanks, Prof. Broadbent. As you rightly pointed out, this requires a balance. And it's not an easy task, I must say. I'm just watching, from the comfort of my living room as policymakers try to strike that balance. But one thing that I can say, and it's quite interesting, there are two court cases that came out. It's that I didn't get a chance to lay my hands on them, but from what is already circulating, and I'm speaking from a legal background as a lawyer by training, policymakers have to make sure that they are rational in their approach when they come up with these regulations, with these policies. And they must also be reasonable. And this is nothing new. There are a number of court cases involving policy matters that were handed out by our courts previously, where these two key principles were made clear. Now, if you look at some of the decisions or even the regulations passed in recent times, you ask yourself, is there a proper balance? Going back to your question, this also makes us reflect, because many of the policymakers are leaders that we have elected. And it raises questions about maybe bad decisions made in the past that would be enabling them today to strike that balance that we are talking about. Another key issue that I need to mention already at this early stage is that, I personally published and touched on this issue in the area of sectoral determinations in labor law that can be issued in terms of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act by a minister. And the question that I've been asking is that how wise is it for one person to issue or to be given the power to issue sectoral determinations? Well, they are good, I must say, but if you compare them with other laws that are debated, the public is invited to give comments and so on, it raises questions that few people have to walk that tightrope without, the broader input. Now, broad, I don't refer to a small committee, I refer to the South African populace that is affected by these regulations. One last point before I hand over to you is that these policy issues in striking a balance, one has to think about all other challenges that we face as a country. So you cannot sort of look at this from a narrow point of view. What may come across as balanced for a professor staying at the suburb may not be that balance when it comes to somebody who stays in a squatter camp, who has to go to a communal shack, communal tap to collect water. So it's a tricky act, but it can be managed by people being reasonable and rational in exercising the powers that they have. I think I should stop here, Prof. Robert.
No, that's very interesting. I mean, just to explain for people who are listening internationally, we had a judgment yesterday in particular that criticized we are unlocking in levels, and it criticized the levels and indeed the highest level of lockdown as irrational in many of its respects, in the sense that many of the regulations simply did not relate to the stated objective. For example, limiting exercise to between 6 and 9 a.m. There's no particular reason for that in relation to the objective, and that is, I think, part of what you're saying, Professor Mpedi, that not just the fairness that comes with the legislative process, but also the actual quality of law, the actual quality of it, is part of its fairness and is a requirement on administrative law in particular, and on constitutional law. Can I pick up on the last thing you mentioned, which was about proportionality, yes, which is also a principle of constitutional law, and the different risks that different groups face. So, as you mentioned, locking down, which is the go-to measure, restricting of movement and restricting of economic activity, means something quite different to different people if you live in a suburb versus if you don't. If you live in a township. So how do you think that plays out? And in particular, what do you do in a country like South Africa, where there are different people living in it's a very, very unequal country. So locking down for some people it's fine, or even perhaps quite nice if you can sit at home in your pajamas and work instead of having to drive to an office. So how do you make law that deals with the inequalities in a country, but is nonetheless that deals with those inequalities? It's something that goes more generally when we're in the country as well, actually, but in particular in this kind of context where what's feasible for one group is quite different, is quite unfeasible for another. I'm asking you an impossible question, but I'm sure you're able to answer.
Yes, Prof. Broadbent, I'm so used to calling you Alex that I keep on saying
You can call me Alex, it's fine. I just feel I should be respectful as the pairs.
Alex, yes, it's a difficult question, but one thing that I can tell you is that if you look at many of the judgments in South Africa that deal with socio-economic rights, are clear in terms of, in policy making that measures must be put in place to also cater for the most vulnerable in our societies. And now, you can't come up with a one-size-fits-all. And in all fairness to the government, when these lockdown measures were introduced, a number of measures were put in place to try and sort of minimize the impact. Whether they are effective or not is something to discuss another day. How they were handled is something to discuss another day. But I want to pick on a simple, one simple example where, it raises question in terms of, the policymakers, did they really apply their mind as best as they should have? Now, this is the issue of hairdressers. Many of them are ordinary people that are just, obviously I don't go to hairdressers, can see with my short hair, but well, we are in this together. Take the taxi sector and the hairdressers. These two sectors, taxi sector is allowed, and rightfully so, I guess, with some modification and adjustments to ferry certain number of passengers and all that. And then hairdressers, what is the difference if a hairdresser, with an appointment sees one customer with the necessary precautionary measure? Just to reconcile the two, for me, it does not make sense. So these are some of those challenges that I find really hard, that they could have been handled differently. Now, when it comes to the vulnerable, the most vulnerable, like the people who live in shacks and all that, there, Alex, I don't have answers. But one thing I can say is that, this is what, the 26th or 26th year of our democracy, and we still have this problem. And every year, the Auditor General in his report reports on billions lost through wasteful expenditure. It's a problem. I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, well, I can't help but share your implied and explicitly stated views about that. Let me give you this potential opportunity to say, what would you say to the government? What could they do, particularly with inequality in mind, with regards to their regulations, not from a perspective of knowing what's going to happen from a scientific perspective, but just given their goals at the moment, which is to ease the lockdown because they have to for economic, social reasons, while maintaining some level of reduction of social contact. Is there anything they could do, in your view, to make the current regulations fairer, more rational, and just better for the worst off?
Alex, from where I'm sitting, it's easy to say these kind of things. But what I just want to emphasize is that the first thing is we know the necessary precautionary mechanisms that have to be put in place. With the right mechanisms, back to the taxi sector, face masks, taxis being disinfected and all that, using the same principles, can't we use them and extend this to other sectors and say, look, these are the protective measures that we have to take, limit the number of customers that you see so that then people can provide for their families. All I would ask is for a rational approach which is balanced and without all these unnecessary discrepancies between sectors. Obviously, safety comes first, but it gets to a point where you don't understand now who's being protected and what is happening. Is this haphazard, or what seems to me to be a haphazard approach that is troubling, and at the same time, people's livelihoods are affected?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Letlokwa, Professor Mpedi.
Thank you.
We'll chat again in a moment.
Yes.
Professor Sridhar Venkatapuram is an associate professor in global health and philosophy at King's College London Global Health Institute. Also an old buddy of mine, I should say. We studied together for our doctorates when we were both at Cambridge some unspecified number of years ago. Professor Venkatapuram, welcome. You can hear us, we can see you. Let me start by asking you, I know you've been very exercised about this, about the need for global public health ethics and the way this pandemic has shown up the lack of any such thought. What do you think that nation states and the global health infrastructure can do to address the kind of problems you've been highlighting? What sort of things can it do? I mean, I think part of what you've been saying is that they should simply think about ethical problems and about ethical problems as they arise in global public health. Is there more beyond that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to jump into the answer without the formal introductions and stuff. But so I think that there's very practical things to do. You're absolutely right that I think that there's been an absolute lack of consideration of ethics, all different kinds of ethics in the way that we have implemented policies worldwide. But I also think that the kinds of ethics that now are proliferating, all these publications, have been very confused and haphazard and focused largely on clinical ethics. What I really want to talk about, and why I think this seminar is really excellent at it, is this idea of social ethics and political ethics, and why inequality is such a really important subject in that kind of conversation. So what can we practically do? I think you were asking about what is an ethical framework that we can practically do. Mm-hmm. So the one single thing following on from the previous discussion is that government policies are lacking the imagination of saying, what is the primary unit of our concern? Is it a sector or is it a person? And which people are we interested in what we're trying to do? And I think that South Africa is a profoundly important model for this, because you have a history where the laws did not acknowledge certain kinds of people and were framed for certain other kinds of people. And so what has happened is to reimagine, not between sort of whites and blacks and coloreds, but think about different kinds of social and economic groups or gradations of vulnerability and say, what does this look like if I am an individual living in a crowded shanty and have to make a living? How will I survive this pandemic and how do I make a living? And what are the laws that help me do that and help the other people act in such a way that helps me do that? So what we have right now are laws that are driven by either epidemiological reasoning that says contain and control, which is we need to contain the infections and do anything and everything that we can to do it, which doesn't really think about what the impacts are on people aside from just the biological aspect of containing infections. But there is no person that actually thinks, what are the multiple dimensions of the impacts of our policies? What's the biological, economic, social, religious, all these other kinds of things? But the most practical thing that you can do is right now, laws can say, what is it? How can we imagine the world from the person who's the worst off and think about what sort of laws and regulations and reforms do we need in order to enable them to prevent infections and prevent death?
Thank you. I mean, it's almost like a failure of imagination, in a sense. Both on, I mean, here it's striking on the part of the leadership in the region, somehow not understanding what it. I mean, I don't understand from experience, but nonetheless, I can imagine what it must be like if you're living in a small room with 10 people, I don't see how I would sustain that for long periods of time. It doesn't take much of much imagination to imagine that. So, and then of course between countries, and this is interesting as well. I mean, and I suppose this relates to the global aspect of what you're saying. I mean, when you decide or when you put out advice from a central context, or you develop a model and you put pressure on leaders internationally to do something, you know, what effect does that have? Can I ask about? I mean, the concern that some people have raised about this is that there's a risk of quite the opposite, of increasing nationalism and of increasing borders and boundaries between people. So may I ask you a little about that? How do you think that interacts with the ethos that you're pushing, the idea that you're pushing, that there really needs to be greater empathy between people? How do you see that playing out at a time when there's a risk, indeed, of in some, you know, for example, the way America's behaving, the World Health Organization, seems to be a risk of a reduction of empathy between nations?
Yeah, so one of the first things that I have to point out is that this pandemic is not a natural disaster. It's not an act of God. It's a socially created pandemic, and it is global dimensions to it, right? So it started in one place. It traveled through, first it initially traveled through airplane flights, right? So this is where people who were traveling across countries. So one of the first things that we have to recognize is that health is global. This is one of these fundamental basics that we keep forgetting. So right now we keep talking about health within our country, but what we need to realize is that this is not a new thing, that health has always been affecting us from global proportions. And in some countries, particularly LMIC countries, the global is much more directly affecting health, and not just from a virus, but from other policies, travel policies, trade policies, and all these other kinds of things. So when I talk about empathy, it's not even just human empathy, it's to be able to recognize the relationships across countries that impact the health of our people within our own country. So that would be one sort of place to do it. The second thing why I raise that is that health policy is a very political endeavor. It's never been medical or science as people imagine to be. It's always been political. And in domestic politics, the foreigner and the abroad are always been a way to excuse domestic policy, or to blame it on other people, or to sort of find some other external reason for why things are the way they are. And that's been true for everything. That's one of the things about international relations. We always know that the way that international relations works is actually a reflection of domestic politics, because politicians are hired or they get elected domestically, and so they play those games in order to do that. So this is one of the reasons why the US and the WHO are the way they are, is because the domestic political situation required or necessitated the blaming of foreigners in order to be able to explain away these sort of domestic stuff. And that's also happening in many African countries right now as well. So we always need that external bad guy in order to be able to use for whatever reasons that we're going to do. The empathy bit, I think, is profoundly important, and I think we'll talk about this more later on, which is that the idea of vulnerability, right? So we are seeing states failing to do their basic obligation to protect the health of their people, or to prevent a great harm from affecting people. That brings together a shared understanding of, oh God, we are all human beings who are living under governments of various kinds of capacities. And I think that that is one of the things that we need to also focus on in terms of, what does this pandemic do for our empathy across countries? Is that actually we're all finding out the richest countries are actually doing the worst. So they have no higher ground to look down upon in terms of, we don't really have that much in common with those other countries. Actually, it turns out that whether you're rich or poor country, that people actually are very vulnerable, and their governments haven't been able to came to act accordingly. This has great implications for what we do in the future. We can either go back to the way that we were, or we can actually now sort of think about if health is on the basis that health is actually not something that governments have taken seriously, and that's what the equalizer is about, is that governments have just basically been incapable of dealing with health issues well, then in the future, what does this mean in terms of how we relate to each other and what sort of systems we build?
That's very interesting. It made me think when you were talking about the politics that we talk about political economy sometimes because politics and economics are connected. You can almost think about political health in a sense as well, the connection between politics and health. Just briefly on that last point, of course, the rich countries have done worse in some ways because of the fact that they have a more vulnerable population because of the way the disease works. It attacks older people. And there's almost a leveling aspect to the disease, which is very unusual. Normally, most infectious diseases target the poor in effect, and because of the age gradient, and the way that age is correlated with health, it's had the opposite. It's had the opposite effect. It was very interesting. Is there anything that you would say to? I mean, it's similar to the question I asked Lutlocker at the end there. That you would say to the global health community then, a lesson you would like them to learn from this, either for future pandemics, but also, frankly, for the much larger existing disease burden, which does fall primarily on the poor.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so there's so many things I would want to scream and shout about, but I think one thing that I would say is that this is a reflection of the neglect of healthy conditions rather than health care for illnesses. This is a reflection of the worst off in every country, rich or poor, not being able to have a basic level of resilience against a health threat. And those basic health conditions are primary health care for sure, but it's also the access to clean water, it's access to soap, it's access to basic abilities to safe living conditions. It's the ability to have a refrigerator so you can put food in it for a week so that you don't have to worry about it going off. It's those kinds of basic quality of life / public health conditions that enable people to be resilient against health shocks. It's not just against one virus. If you actually had raised those, you would have raised those against every epidemic threat and also prevent a number of chronic conditions as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you. We'll talk again in a moment when we talk as a panel. But let me turn now to Professor Stephen Friedman. Welcome.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was sitting in the dark, but I've rectified.
That happens to all of us. Professor Friedman, welcome. Professor Friedman is a professor of political science, I believe an emeritus professor of political science at the University of Johannesburg. He is a political scientist who specializes in the study of democracy. He's also a writer, he's been an activist, a trade unionist, and quite generally, I think, a public intellectual. So it's a great pleasure and honor to have you with us. Can we start perhaps by asking a little bit about human rights and perhaps social economic rights as well, since we haven't focused much on those yet. Do you think that, how do you think they factor in a situation like this when you have an emergency, or not perhaps a disaster, but a state of emergency? And do you think, I mean, because of course the problem is that there's a tendency when there is an emergency to say, oh dear, we can't worry about that now. What's your stance on that? How much is it justified to set rights aside, to derogate from them? And how much of the setting aside in this context has, do you think, been justified?
Well, I think the first point that must be made is that in any pandemic, in a pandemic or an epidemic, some rights will have to be sacrificed. I think that's axiomatic. I mean, every constitution has a clause on emergency powers. We don't object and shouldn't object when armies or police forces are used to cordon off flooded areas or areas where there are raging fires, etc. and there we're obviously talking about various forms of freedom of movement and freedom to trade, etc. But the point I'm making in an article which has just appeared today is that there are important questions to be asked about the legitimacy of those measures. And I mean, that's come up in my colleagues' comments on the lockdown legislation here. Beyond that, I think it's very important to say that, and if I can link the two in this way, there is nothing irrational about the South African regulations in the sense that they're not capricious or arbitrary. They are based on a particular way of viewing a large number of South African citizens, which goes directly to your question. Because to me, a human rights-based approach, which I would recommend for a variety of reasons, would assume, which I believe to be true and which I believe I can demonstrate with evidence, that whether people live in poverty or in wealth, they wish to protect themselves. They are not irrational beings. And that we need to understand also that knowledge is not knowledge of something like an epidemic, or certainly knowledge of the way it affects us, is not restricted to people with a formal education and more affluent people. I mean, the knowledge in the grassroots of the society that we do have a dreadful disease running through the country and that people need to protect themselves, I would argue is very strong. But it was, I'm convinced, and I can show this by their statements, the thinking of the South African government was that people in shack settlements and townships, if they are left to their own devices, will not protect themselves. So that when the Minister of Cooperative Governance explains the ban on cigarettes, she explains that people in townships share cigarettes. There's no evidence, of course, that they do so any more than people anywhere else. When the sale of hot food is banned, it's explained that people will sell this on street corners in townships, and that will damage public health in that way. The ban on alcohol is justified by fairly scary pictures of which one of the ministers was talking about this morning, of people who lose all their inhibitions and go out into the streets and start damaging public health. Now, as soon as you take that view of the citizenry, your view will be that the only way in which you can guard against a public health emergency is to send out 73,000 troops and, if necessary, lock people up, and worse if they disobey. I don't believe that was necessary. I don't even believe that it was the best way of fighting the pandemic. As we look at South Africa today, the problem we find in South Africa today is not that poor people and people living in shacks are unable to protect or don't want to protect themselves, is that they're increasingly unable to protect themselves as the protections are peeled back. One of the things which really strikes me as a sort of vignette of South African life today is the palpable fear which people in townships and shack settlements express about getting into taxis. And it's an entirely legitimate fear in my view. And people are not getting into taxis because they're foolish. They're getting into taxis because if they don't get into the taxis, they will lose their jobs and they will starve. So to me, the South African experience, and I'm sure it's not only the South African experience, really illustrates that if by a human rights approach you mean an approach which recognizes citizens as autonomous beings who are capable of choice and who are capable of rational choice, then I think that we would be in a much better position in South Africa had the government adopted that. I don't think it's unrealistic or romantic to argue that we could have had an approach in which the government, instead of simply imposing on people, had tried to take people along with it and had involved organizations and said, well, look, how do we fashion a response to this which protects life and health, but also recognizes people's rights?
Yes, it is striking. It struck me as well, certainly in this country, how infantilizing the government's approach has been. Simply said, oh, people do these things, implying that those people are not the people one is talking to. It's them, us, you know, and it's just a remarkable, I mean, in this country, remarkable historical resonances that just seem to be, current leaders are simply just seem to be totally insensitive to. I think it's very interesting. I wonder if I can ask you about a topic that relates to what Sridhar was talking about just now, and that you have also written about, which is about the relationship between the North and the South, and the fact that the global North, appears not to have done better, and that it seems to undermine, as you pointed out, the idea that the way the global South should conduct its affairs should be to copy the North. So yeah, perhaps you can tell us what you think about that as well, since I know you've written about it.
Yeah, well, you know, we've made the point, you know, already that, and you've made it yourself, that the rich countries are doing worse than the poor countries. And of course, you're correct to say that the age profile is part of it. But a more important part of it, as I think Sridhar was suggesting, and I would agree wholeheartedly, is the understanding of health in the global North. It's been understood almost purely as curative health, as very effective and very, you know, very technologically advanced forms of curative medicine. Now, of course, to state the obvious, curative medicine is not very much good at dealing with a disease for which there's no cure, which is the reality which we faced with COVID-19. And what we're seeing is that, in contrast to the rich countries' curative medicine, we're finding that in other parts of the world, I mean, obviously, beginning with East Asia, where you know, there's a debate about whether countries are first world or third world or not. But precisely because of previous experiences, East Asia is very well set up to put in place the preventive measures you need to deal with viruses. But even outside East Asia, whether you're looking at the Indian state of Kerala, which mobilizes faith-based organizations and community organizations to fight the virus very effectively, or Senegal on our own continent, which relies, among other things, on devising testing equipment which costs $1 instead of $60. And using 3D printing to produce a ventilator which costs $60 instead of $6,000 or whatever the state-of-the-art machine costs. We're finding that rich countries are good at some things, and poorer countries are probably better at other things. And the first point is that it really challenges this notion, which we tend to have, that expertise is always in the global North and incapacity is always in the global South. Now, I hope I'm not proved wrong by subsequent events, but well-meaning people, Melinda Gates and Gordon Brown, etc., have predicted this absolute carnage as the virus rips through Africa. Now, as I say, I'm hesitant about this because tragically it could still happen, but the reality is that so far it hasn't happened. And I think one of the reasons it hasn't happened so far is that in some African countries, because of the Ebola experience, because of some other experiences, you know, people might not have ventilators and they might not have the top surgeons, but they have an ability to deal with preventative medicine. And of course, you know, to me, this is an indication of, as I did write, and as you correctly say, that, you know, in South Africa, across the board, you know, whether it's people in the suburbs or people in government who come from a liberation background. I think we tend to automatically assume that the global north, what is called the first world, is the repository of all expertise, and the best we can do is try to emulate that. Really, we need to rethink that. Kerala is a very interesting example. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, I put up on social media a very revealing clip to me of a feeding scheme run by the police in Calcutta. And what was revealing about this, it sounds trivial, but it's profound, is in this country, and you know, a feeding scheme is a process in which well-meaning people dump hampers on other people, usually violating all the health protocols. In Calcutta, the way they do this is that they spread out a variety of food items on plates 2 meters or 3 meters from each other. And they organize it so that each individual goes through and chooses from the plates what they want and then walks off. This is profoundly different because it's actually assumed that people living in poverty have a choice, which we tend not to assume here. That if the woman who's come to feed her family has children who don't like beans, she can take home the potatoes or the rice instead. And to me, it sounds like, you know, it's just, you know, it sounds symbolic, but it was very important. As each individual walks past, the police officers make a point of greeting them all individually and of thanking them for coming. So you immediately have a very different relationship. And, you know, you wouldn't find that that's not the way in which countries in the global north deal with poverty. And it's not the way in which South Africa deals with poverty, because the reason this first world, third world dichotomy fascinates me so much is that in South Africa we have both. And when I criticize the way in which people assume that the first world is superior to the third world in all things, that's really a South African attitude, which assumes that the suburbs are superior to everybody else in all things. And I think we're being taught that's not so.
Thank you. Okay, I want to throw this open now. Before I put any questions, does any of you want to comment on what any of the other of you have said, since there was quite a lot said, and I saw some various nodding and laughing as well at times.
Only to disagree profoundly with my colleague about hairdressers. It's a very dangerous enterprise when COVID-19. So even when it's over, I'm not going up. We're going to have to work out something. No, seriously, it's a very high risk activity.
Sridhar.
I just wanted to quickly say this last example, I think, is a really profound story. What I see across countries that I am very associated with and stuff, what is happening in the United States is about a fight for equal standing and equal respect. And what we just saw in this example is a way that a government institution is trying to show equal standing and equal respect, even if you are hungry and poor. And this is one of the fundamental things that I think we are lacking across societies, is that for a government institution to be able to say and show that every individual and every citizen has equal standing and equal respect, and the government is meant to treat that way. So the condescending attitude of public health policies or ministers shows that this is not being, that is not the case. And I just wanted to just quickly make the point that out of this pandemic is really the opportunity to really kind of profoundly reconsider what does equal standing as a member of a community mean? What does it mean in terms of equal citizenship? And how much longer do you think government should be allowed to have a condescending attitude towards one set of people versus a laudatory attitude towards another set of people, or, you know, deny the knowledge of some while sort of profoundly mimicking the others? I think that this is really on a much more profound level about equal standing and equal citizenship.
can I ask about this this issue of public health being political, which you raised, Sridhar? Can I put that to the other panelists? I mean, Tlokwe, do you think? I mean, obviously, health provision is political, but public health goes beyond that. Public health goes to living conditions and so forth. So, in a sense, you know, when you put it like that, it seems quite obvious that it is. Do you think that's recognized in the South African context? Do you think it's recognized in South African law? I mean, I know there are certain universities, I won't name any, where it has been quite difficult for quite a long time to obtain soap to wash one's hands. I'm sure that will change in the future. I forget which ones they are. But I mean, what's your sense of to what extent that is really understood in the context of, well, employment as well, indeed, as well as in delivery of services?
Thank you, Alex. You know, in our constitution, we've got the right of access to healthcare. And one thing I can tell you is that, you know, talking about access to healthcare as a right and all that can sometimes be misleading, because there is often a discrepancy between rights and duties on statute books and rights and duties in reality. Like you have pointed out now, that there are instances where even something as basic as soap, you know, may not always be readily available in bathrooms. In workplaces, we know the occupational health and safety does make provision for, does impose a duty on employers to provide a safe working environment where things that may appear as basic as soap, you know, in the bathroom, may not always be there. So the biggest challenge is, in my opinion, in this country of ours, is not having adequate legal provisions about access to healthcare or health issues, but it's the gap between, you know, what is in statute books, for example, in policy documents, and what is happening in reality.
Does that relate to the notion of respecting people and treating them as individuals? I mean, you know, it's one thing when the system sort of breaks down and doesn't work, but I mean, you know, the story about presenting people in poverty with choices. I mean, I suspect that there's a connection there as well with, you know, treating, you know, seeing that people have needs and rights to hygiene provision. It certainly seems from the statistics I've seen that not everyone in this country has the means to practice the kind of personal hygiene that is required at the moment. I mean, is there anything? I mean, is it a matter of political change or of rights, or is it almost a sort of cultural, national, not cultural in the sense of a particular culture, but in the sense of an institutional culture or a national psychology that needs to change?
One thing that comes to my mind, Alex, you know, I recently received a clip from a former master student of mine, where a brother of a former of our former president, one of our former presidents, said something that stuck with me as a taxpayer. I'm sure Prof. Friedman saw it, where he said, you know, there's something fundamentally wrong in our country where, you know, we pay twice for things. You know, we pay taxes so that we can get, you know, health care, but which we don't get. And then people go ahead and then contribute towards medical aid. So we need to deal with such issues, you know. We need to deal with this culture of wasteful expenditures running into billions that could be used, you know, somewhere in a fruitful manner. We need to deal, you know, once and for all with issues such as fraud and corruption, you know, and things like that. Because in my view, as a social security expert, a lot of resources or money has been wasted over the last 25 years, running into billions that, in my view, if that was used properly, we shouldn't be sitting with the levels of poverty and all these challenges that you can't get solved. Now, while you know, having this opportunity, I just want to mention one thing, Alex and fellow panelists, that will, will take us, slightly away from the question that we have asked, and that I don't want us to lose sight of. Particularly to some of the issues that Prof. Friedman raised, which I agree with. But there is this issue that I struggle with, as a simple man coming from a village where people, that I can identify with, where people have to choose between staying in your little shack and starve to death, or take, your chances and go out there and get something to survive, hopefully a little bit longer. That there is no dignity in that. We can mention all sorts of rights. There's no rights in this. There is no balance. There's nothing. It's a matter of survival where people have to choose between those two. I believe no one should be put in such a position. No mother should be put in a position where should sit and look at the children starving, or go out to look for something to eat for the children and be arrested. And at the same time, criminals are released, and then people are arrested for violating some of these regulations. Something is wrong. So going back to the question that you've asked, Alex, it's a matter of us as South Africans to rise, not in rebellion. I think we are such a submissive, to a certain extent, maybe I would dare say, I know people will skin me alive, sort of accepting society. And I don't know when this will change. And as electorates, it's not like we are being done a favor when our taxes are not used appropriately, and so on. People have been talking about a rebellion of taxpayers, and I think pandemics like this, we talk about post-COVID, should encourage people to stand up and say, this is not how I want my tax to be spent or to be wasted. I will stop there. You see, I'm warming up, Prof. Broadbent.
Yeah, no, it's powerful. I think, I mean, what's interesting for me, and maybe I can put this as the last question to all of you, really. What's interesting to me is that there have been quite a few rather famous cases of people leaving and breaching lockdown when they had no need to do so at all because they were rather wealthy. So there's a famous case in Dominic Cummings in the UK. I don't know if he's wealthy or not, but he was notoriously an author of the lockdown regulations there. And here we've had, hilariously, in my view, a minister being so stupid, frankly, as to post a picture of a Sunday lunch with friends on social media shortly after lockdown was introduced, and then claim that it was a business meeting to collect protective equipment or something like that. I mean, what is the explanation for this? Is it that people? Is it this idea of is it again this infantilizing or dehumanizing approach where you think that people need to be told what to do, but it doesn't apply to us who are doing the telling? This is for anyone really. What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to respond because I'd also like to respond to the previous issue, just briefly, if I may. I think really what is going on is the sense, it sounds trite, is that the rules apply to them, they don't apply to us. And it's not, I don't think it's simply, it is infantilizing to a certain extent, because I don't claim any insight into the mind of Dominic Cummings, but I think I understand a bit about how South African politicians approach the world. And the assumption is that we know how to protect ourselves, so we can go and have lunch with our friends. And the fact that she put it up on social media was very revealing. I mean, what Cummings did has caused a great deal of damage, but he did it under the radar. He didn't boast about it afterwards. No. He boasted about it afterwards because she really believes that she has a superior ability to protect herself to other people. Now, in that context, I just wanted to make 2 points about your question about the politics of public health as they're playing out at the moment. And interestingly, in both the examples I want to use, they're playing out in many ways identically in South Africa and the UK. The first one is this message from governments that it's now up to you. We've done what we can, and it's now up to you. And in many respects, that is an absurd message. It is not an absurd message to people living in affluence, because we know that we must socially distance, etc., and we have the capacity to do that. We're having this conversation remotely. We're not sitting in a hall. But it is not up to the people in townships and shack settlements to make sure that they have running water and that they don't have to sit in crowded taxis. It is the responsibility of the government. And governments should not be allowed to pass the buck to citizens. Of course, it's very convenient to governments, because if what happens in South Africa up to now, from now onwards, it's simply up to us. If we have a sharp spike in the number of infections and deaths, then it's not the policymakers' fault or the politicians' fault, it's simply the citizens' fault. The other thing which we have here, which is also an issue in the UK, is follow the science, in which politicians and policymakers and really the whole sort of national debate assumes that if you simply hand over the response to a pandemic to medical scientists, and it's always only medical scientists. It's not people with social knowledge. It's not people with knowledge of society. It's not people of knowledge of poverty and inequality. If you hand them over to them, all will be well. Now, that might have been a valid argument in South Africa when we had to deal with HIV and AIDS, where the science was quite clear that if you took antiviral medication and avoided certain forms of behavior, you'd probably not be infected. It's not an appropriate response to a virus in which the scientists themselves are quick to acknowledge that they very often know as little as anybody else, because this disease is only a few months old. And very often it gets used as a means of ensuring unaccountable decision making. So in this context, in this country, the government's chief scientific advisor can continually tell the public that a severe epidemic is inevitable, when he presumably knows that it isn't inevitable because it hasn't happened in Korea or Australia or New Zealand or various other places we could mention, or where scientists can simply say that there'd be no malnutrition in Soweto until the lockdown. And we don't challenge this because, after all, they're scientists. I don't claim to be a medical scientist, but I do read newspapers. And when people say things in public which are not logical and which are contradicted by evidence which is in front of all of us, I think as democratic citizens we should hold them to account.
No, there is nothing less satisfactory than seeing science on the one hand claim it is the bastion of critical thinking, and on the other hand say it shouldn't be criticised. My very last question, relating to that, Sridhar, I mean, since you're very much plugged into the public health world, and do you think that we are going to see the financial crisis of 2008 was a sobering episode for economics? Do you think we're going to see this as a sobering episode for public health or for epidemiology? Is this Epidemiology's 2008?
That's a great question. Because I just have one last possible answer, I'm just going to say three things. One, to answer your question, but two, to follow up on the previous one.
That's also fine.
So one, on the question of political stuff. I agree with you. If you think about politics as a distribution of valuable goods, then it is political, and there's no question about it. There's a different story that I also want to tell, which is that this pandemic literally shows that health is social, that the virus passes around from person to person, and it's done through social interactions. The other profound thing that it's very clear in Africa is that it first affected the elites. If you can travel internationally and get a flight and get the resources, so this is a disease that's come from the elites, and it's now going to spread to the poor people unless there's some severe wall that's built between the rich and the poor. It's not. And so then what's going to happen is that the vulnerabilities that the poor have are going to be sort of what exposes them to this infection. So it's political in the sense of social interactions, and how we relate to each other is actually how people get disease and die. And this is not novel to a virus. This is also how it happens normally. And that's one of the most important lessons that now is recognizable to people that people before didn't get. That's how it's political, aside from the distribution of resources. The second thing is that this is a talk about the future, and what I want to say is that from today is the future, but there are great injustices happening right now regarding COVID policies in South Africa and in other African countries. So, for example, different African countries are quarantining people and then asking them to pay for their fees. And then if they don't, then they're kept there until they're due. There's a great amount of discrimination. Testing is done randomly. It's being used and stuff. So there's a great amount of injustices that are happening. And the quicker that people start to recognize and to do something about it, the more we have a likelihood that people will change. Otherwise, a year from now, people talk about, oh, remember when these horrible things were happening. This is actually what needs to happen now. The second, into your question, is this the same for epidemiology that it is for economics? So I don't know if economics learned anything, because what did economics learn? So, there was toxic growth after 2008. And as a result of it, now we say, oh, we've actually made inequality worse. And then now what are we going to do about it? Actually, the economists are the ones who are now talking about how we should have done epidemiology differently and how we should be thinking about the future, where we think about equity in growth. Epidemiologists aren't talking about equity. They're talking about how wonderful their models have been in being able to explain this and how they're explaining it in models. There's great controversies that are about to arise in epidemiology, and I think, Alex, you're going to be part of this, which is that the mathematical models that explained that Imperial used that resulted in shockdown were simple mathematical models that only looked at biological outcomes. They actually didn't look at social inequalities and the distribution of vulnerability and unequal vulnerability and that impact on subsequent infections. If they did, they would have told us that older people would have died. They would have told us that poor people would have died. They would have told us that many other people would have died. And instead, all they told us was randomly, this many people will die in the population, and the lockdowns were implemented as a result of this generic mathematical abstraction. So I think that's one thing that's going to happen to epidemiology. The second thing is social epidemiology is going to become much more prevalent, where essentially we're going to start to understand that health and health inequalities are not just simply biological things, they're actually socially sort of determined. And so how do people understand and address those kinds of social aspects? So will epidemiology learn? Well, not according to the way that the superstars of Imperial and Harvard epidemiologists are essentially becoming the de facto voice about what's going to happen. So I think that we have a job here. Nothing is given here. And so we really have to think about what is it that we're going to do in order to make sure that there is sort of, what you said, will epidemiology transform as a result of this pandemic? Or will it sort of say, no, we actually knew all along and people just didn't listen to us? And I think that there are both. There's both of those things going on, but we need to see that happen.
Well, that's pretty much all we have time for. Thank you. I suppose I should just finish by saying that as regards epidemiology, of course, and I don't mean to, and I don't think you mean to, sort of talk about a whole science and all the sciences in it. I think there's a rather small group of people who are engaged in modeling, and they are a small part of the infectious disease epidemiology community, who are a small part of the whole of epidemiology, many of whom, as you know, people like Michael Marmot and Nancy Krieger are indeed very much in tune with these issues. So, but I know you know that. I'm just saying that for the sake of people who might see this and feel criticized by what I said as well. But I think that's all we have time for. It's a remarkable thing, as I've remarked on every week pretty much, and I don't quite get over it, how close we can get to being on time in this new forum, which is just completely novel for academic events. But we're only 4 minutes over time. So thank you so much. That was wonderful. And I hope we will speak to each other again, and I'll speak to each of you very soon. Thanks to everyone for listening and watching.
Thank you for including me, and lots of luck with the summer.
The University of Johannesburg. The future reimagined.